Right, so we've worked out why we hold directors to account and who actually is a director, realising it's beyond those people who are just validly appointed. Like, most of the time it's just going to be those who are validly appointed, but it can be on that if people try and get around the system. There also are a couple of occasions when people have got themselves into a bit of trouble becoming shadow directors when they didn't know they were actually shadow directors. But that's a rare instance that you can ask me about, but we won't go into in detail. So we have these directors who are running the company, and we're going to say that they owe these duties, right? They owe these fiduciary duties to the company. To the company. What does that mean? What does it mean to owe your duty to the company? And again, that is actually not a clear-cut concept to understand. So let's dive into it. So directors are agents of the company, and like all agents, they owe duties. But if they're an agent of the company, and the company is the principal, how do we conceptualize what the principal wants? Well, the classic answer to that is that we need to think about what is in the interests of the company as a whole. Okay, the company as a whole. That's a really important thing. Now, by company as a whole, we do not mean, okay, that does not equal the majority of shareholders. Okay? It's beyond the majority, right? Because, okay, just say you own 51% and you wanted to do something, then you would be able to take advantage of that, maybe pay yourself a lot of money out of the company at the expense of the other 49%. Right? That would clearly be wrong. It's something called oppression of the minority. So company as a whole means more than the majority of shareholders. You've got to look that it's good for the company. In fact, directors do not owe a duty to shareholders at all. They don't owe a duty to creditors or society or employees or any stakeholder. They owe it to the company. However, what you've got to do is recognise that the interests of the company align with these stakeholders. Okay, so what you have to do is you have to look at the interests of the important stakeholders that will affect the long-term interests of the company. Okay, so if it's going to affect the long-term interests of the company, then you can take that into account when you're making decisions. Okay, why is that important? Owing your duty to the company does not mean maximising profit, particularly in the short term. Okay, that's just not me saying that. The Australian Corporations and Markets Advisory Committee several years ago, about a decade ago now, or even a little bit longer, held an inquiry into this following the James Hardie incident where the company went overseas. And the board was saying, look, we had to do that because it maximised shareholder wealth. And the government said, well, is that the duty of directors? Do directors have to maximise shareholder wealth? Is that their purpose and their duty? And so they held a big inquiry. The Corporates and Markets Advisory Committee came back and said, no, you don't. Right? Maximising shareholder wealth, particularly in the short term, is not the duty of directors. Another way that it's been talked about is a judge in one of their judgments stated, you can think about the interests of the company as the interests of current and future shareholders. So think about what that means. Because current shareholders want the share price to be as high as it possibly can. And future shareholders want the current price to be as low as possibly, right? Because they want to buy it low. So what the judge is trying to get to is a balance between short-term and long-term interests. Right? You have to be able to be generating enough wealth to be sustainable, but it also has to be sustainable over the long term. So there's a long and distinguished history of recognising the long-term view that directors are meant to take. The view that you need to keep the company sustainable over the longer term in what you're doing. And that can include the interests of your stakeholders, but you are not bound to take them into account. You do not owe them a duty. So perhaps the issue of creditors is perhaps the easiest one to think about here. So what happens in the case of creditors? Well, what you can think of is, you really don't owe a duty to creditors. And how much do you think about creditors? Well, if the company's going well, not much. Why? They're getting paid, they're getting their part of the deal, right? So it's a natural part of your operations that you don't need to think much about them. However, as you approach insolvency, right, the interests of the creditors become more important to the company. If you don't have the support of the creditors as you're getting closer and closer to the line of insolvency, it's less likely you'll survive into the longer term. If they withdraw their credit, you won't be able to pay them back, you'll be insolvent. So I hope you can see that as you approach insolvency, the interests of the creditors become more important to the interests of the company as a whole. And in fact, the interests of the creditors can become more important than the interests of the shareholders, right? Going into administration may mean the shareholders lose everything, but the creditors retain some things. So in many ways, you can see that decision is not in the interests of the shareholders, right? It's actually in the interests of the creditors and the company, because it might allow the company to survive. So really a way to think about the company as a whole is as these mix of interests who you're trying to satisfy in order to ensure your long-term viability. Of course, in general, if you're looking after the shareholders as a group, you will be satisfying this interest of a company as a whole. But technically, it's not exactly the same thing.